Glass has two properties in relation to light. It reflects light and it transmits light. When it reflects light, it can do a number of things. We'll take a look at a plastic container here to see what type of reflections we get out of this. And this plastic container has this frosted finish on part of it. And that frosted finish is creating a myriad of little reflections that give the overall diffuse reflection effect that is typical of that type of surface. Another kind of light reflection occurs with smoother surfaces, and I have here an old glass milk bottle, and when we look at that glass milk bottle in relation to the light, we see these little strong, very small shapes of light called highlights. And so that's another kind of way that light can reflect, which is called specular reflection. It's typical of a very focused kind of reflection off of very smooth surfaces. If you look at this object up close, I'm going to hold a piece of paper up close to it and move it back and forth. You can see that there's quite a subtle shape that occurs from that object that's close to the glass. And that shape can sometimes curve if the glass object itself is curved. So we've looked at a number of ways that glass can reflect light, but glass can also transmit light. If I move it in front of the edge of this piece of paper, you'll see that that sharp line gets kind of wavery and irregular. And so the surface of the glass is curving in such a way that it refracts light. Refraction is the bending of light rays. And you can see this particularly when I turn the bottle around and move it around. You can see how interestingly that the light is bent as information passes through this object. Now I could take another kind of object which is machined in a more regular fashion, which is this plexiglass box. And if I hold that in front of this piece of paper, you won't see that many refraction effects. You might see a few, but it's certainly a lot more subtle. Now, if you have a mission to draw that, you could justifiably say to yourself, well, I don't need to draw refraction effects for that plexiglass box because I didn't see any. But the problem with that is that since subconsciously we all know that glass refracts light and bends light, and so does plexiglass and other kinds of clear plastics, since we know this subconsciously, we expect it. And if you deny that kind of effect, then you're essentially not showing off that potential that glass has. Glass can do a number of other, or has a number of other ways that it affects light when light transmits through it. We go back to the milk bottle, and we hold this in front of the blackboard, and we see that that milk bottle looks a little lighter in relation to the blackboard, but when we hold it in front of the light colored piece of paper, the glass looks a little darker. So the conclusion is that glass essentially is not perfectly transparent, and you should draw it as not perfectly transparent, because if you didn't, people wouldn't know that the glass is there. So in relation to dark and light, it tends to lighten up dark surfaces and darken up light surfaces. So it compresses the contrast of whatever you're seeing through the glass. Now, if I had a colored bottle, I could also show you that glass can have a filtering effect. It could bias the color of what you're seeing through it, either cooler or warmer in various ways. You have to look at glass in a sense like a peacock that wants to show off its feathers. If you don't see that much filtering effect, or if you don't see that much compression of contrast, and you don't see many refraction effects, does that mean that you shouldn't draw them? Probably not. Because if you ignore all those effects, essentially you're denying what glass is proud of. Just like a peacock is proud of its feathers, glass in a sense is proud of everything that it can do to light, both transmitting through it and reflecting from it. So even if you don't see these effects that clearly or that conspicuously, consider exaggerating them or including them nonetheless, because in that way you'll embrace the physical properties of glass and you'll show off its characteristics, and people who look at your work will better understand that it's glass. So the moral of the story is, don't necessarily draw what you see, also draw what you know. So we're going to take a look at a few other considerations now in drawing glass. And I've mapped out a shape of a bottle here, and we're going to see what we can do to create the effect of light, both passing through that and also reflecting from it. So let's take a look now at this bottle. Perhaps I should define it a little bit better so you can see it a little bit better. So I had already traced it out there, and I traced it out after drawing a dotted line down the center when I did it in the red chalk, because that dotted line helped me understand where the central axis of that bottle was, and I made sure that it moved an equal amount to the left as it did to the right at various levels. So I drew a few horizontal lines, and I made sure that it extended out the same this way as that way, essentially because I didn't want the bottle to look lopsided when I drew it, or to appear to be tilting in a strange way. So having done all that preliminary work, we're going to reinforce what was done with red. And I'm imagining the glass bottle, in order to stand up, has a flat bottom. So through the glass, we would maybe see some of that flat bottom as an ellipse here. And so the first thing that I want to do with this is to show off the fact that glass refracts light. And the only way I can do that is to make sure that visual information passes from outside the glass behind the glass. Because if there's nothing behind the glass, how are you going to show off its properties in terms of how it transmits light? So I've drawn a line here that's my guide now to draw a very strongly defined stripe, which could be some type of geometric element that's behind the glass. So I drew it as it entered in. Now I'm drawing it as it exits the glass. But what am I going to do with that effect as seen through the glass? Well, knowing that glass refracts light, which means bending light rays, and thinking of this bottle as an old bottle that's hand blown glass, and which has irregular surface, which would make the refraction effect all the more noticeable, I'm going to make this a kind of a wavy stripe. And I could enhance that wave even more by exaggerating some of that wave and creating already an illusion that this very controlled geometric shape becomes a little irregular as it's seen through the glass. In fact, it's a good idea to select shapes that have straight lines or that are very controlled, because if you're going to throw them into chaos, if they're already chaotic in nature, they're not going to be that apparent as refraction when you see it through the glass. So I've created a refraction effect. And also, it's interesting to note that when you're looking at the glass object like that, the sides of that glass object are going to look perhaps a little more foggy, because when you look at the sides of this object, you're seeing the glass turning away from you. So effectively, you're looking through more thickness of glass. So the glass will have an increasing presence. The fact that it's translucent will become more and more apparent. It's not perfectly transparent. And because the background is fairly dark, it's going to lighten up the background even more near the edges. So I'm going to do that with my chalk. I'm going to lighten up the background all around the perimeter of this glass object, and as we proceed towards the center, that milky effect that shows off the presence of glass will become a little bit less apparent. But closer to the edge, it's even more apparent. So I'm taking the thickness of the glass into account when we're looking close to the perimeter of the object. Okay, so we have a refraction effect. We have a certain indication of the thickness of glass that lightens up what we're seeing in back of the glass. We're almost ready to deal with how light reflects off of this glass bottle. I'm going to add some obscuring effect here on the inside of the opening of that bottle. And now we're going to think about what direction the light is coming from. So I've drawn an arrow here, and that represents to me the fact that the light is coming from a certain angle. And also I'm thinking that it's coming partly from in front of the object. So, inspired from the milk bottle with its specular reflection, I'm going to draw some very controlled highlights in this glass bottle. And it's interesting because this bottle has some concave surfaces and some convex surfaces. So there are times when this surface is pointing up to the light source and reflecting the light back to the viewer when it's convex, and then again when it's concave. So let's see what we can do with this. So light is coming in from the side, multiple light rays. So I've tracked along the curve of that object with some red chalk, and this is going to help me be consistent. If there's one specific light source now that's lighting this very brightly, and if I place a highlight here, I'm going to follow that track. Let's say it's a rectangular light source. So I'm going to follow that track, and the bottle at this point is convex, but essentially it becomes concave, and it's going to reflect that light source again, but it's going to be curving in a different direction. Somewhat smaller because the bottle has become smaller at this point. Then we follow that line back up, and it meets the rim of the bottle, and I'll put a little highlight in there. Now, you could do this highlight in a number of different ways. You could make it a round highlight, just sitting on the rim, but it could look a little artificial. It might not look believable as a highlight. So what I prefer to do is taper that highlight in and out of existence. Now, you may not see it at the distance you are that well, but let's look at this larger. So I'm going to replicate the rim of this bottle over here somewhat bigger. Move some of these objects out of the way. We don't need these anymore. And so I've drawn a little guide here, which is for my minor axis and my major axis, two lines, one vertical, one horizontal. So that helped me draw out that ellipse. And so this essentially is this rim, but somewhat larger. So we have a light reflecting in that rim. So we're going to put it here, and you can see it's a little bit bigger now, so you can see it better. It's tapering in and out of existence. And by doing that, essentially you're honoring the highlight for what it is. It's something that exists. It's a light effect that exists as a result of the glass. It's in a sense almost like part of the glass itself. It's not like a piece of confetti that's just sitting on the glass. So if you do that carefully and taper it in and out of existence, it's going to appear to be fairly convincing. Now, looking at this rim, we can see that it journeys around an arc. And the reason why the light is reflecting in that rim is because the rim at that point is at a certain angle that's just perfect to reflect that light source back to the viewer. If you drew a tangent to that arc, this is what it would look like. So a tangent to that arc would look like this, okay? So it's that particular angle that's reflecting the light back to us. Well, there's another part of that ellipse that has the same tangent, and it's located exactly on the opposite side. If I draw a line connecting that highlight through the center of this ellipse, and I continue that line to the other side, where that line intersects is where a twin highlight will be found. So I'm going to draw that twin highlight in, because at that point, the tangent to that arc is identical in angle to the first tangent. Okay, so these two lines are parallel, and so these two highlights are brought into existence because the angle of the rim is the same on either side. Now, people aren't necessarily conscious of this when they look at glass objects. People are rarely thinking, oh, there must be a partner highlight for every given highlight. There's another one on the other side of the rim. But it's good to know that as an artist, because you can draw convincing light effects from the imagination without observing them. So this, you could say, would be a dominant highlight. If you want the back of the rim to appear to be a bit further away, you can make this highlight a bit bigger so it's more dominant, and keep this one a little smaller. It's going to appear subtly, perhaps, to be further away. You could enhance that effect also by making the rim of the glass somewhat thicker. Even though the back part of that ellipse is further away from you by only a small amount, it's a totally acceptable trick to create that optical illusion of the back being a little bit further away compared to the front by thickening up the line in the front of that rim. So that may not be the only light source. There may be a number of other light sources. So you have a dominant set of highlights, and you could have perhaps a smaller set of highlights in another area, and we can do that line through the center of the ellipse, and we'll see the partner highlight over on the other side. We're going to taper it a little bit. Okay, and looking at a really big example of that taper, I'm going to draw the rim here. This is a really close-up example. This is what it's doing. It's tapering in and out of existence. Okay? So that's what that highlight is doing. And that will more likely guarantee you people believing that that is a light effect rather than just a circular object, like a piece of confetti sitting on the rim. So you could do these highlights in a different way. Let's say if you were working for a Walt Disney film production and you wanted to impart some kind of magic to that highlight as if it was just touched with a magic wand, you could do a star effect. So this has become a convention in art and also photography. It's not something that we actually see when we look at highlights, unless we squint and our eyelashes have a kind of diffraction effect on the highlight, and we might see a light scattering off at different angles. Or if you're a photographer with a diffraction filter, you might see that kind of effect. But it's not something that we generally see in reality, although it's become so much a part of the film business and photography and art production in material related to fantasy subject matter that it seems normal to do that. In my own work, I don't do that. I don't work with that kind of aesthetic, but it could be a choice that you would make. So going back to our object, we're going to essentially create a number of highlights here on the rim, following this same logic, a number of highlights. And we could also consider creating some more subtle highlights that could be because there are lighter shapes in the area, not light sources exactly, but light shapes that are reflecting light that create some subtle effects. So we could do that. We could do an effect of light here, a subtle shape in the bottle that could appear here, and perhaps it would be a little bit brighter near its center. Maybe the light source is very diffuse, so the reflection would appear to be very diffuse as a result. So with a few simple touches, and maybe blurring this out since it would be seen through the bottle, so the bottom flat surface of that bottle would not appear to be a straight line like that. So with a few simple effects like that, we have created a fairly convincing effect. Perhaps a little bit of diffuse reflections here on the bottom rim of the bottle as if it's pointing down to a surface that's reflecting light back up into it. And generally speaking, perhaps a little bit of, I'm just going to rub some chalk in here with my fingers, a little bit of lighter effect in the bottle generally compared to the dark background will convince the viewer even more that this is a glass bottle that is showing off a lot of the properties that we admire about glass.